Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third series of the Public Interest Technology PIC Colloquium. My name is Roba Abbas, and I'm a visiting professor at Arizona State University School for the Future of Innovation in Society and a senior lecturer at the School of Business at the University of Wollongong, Australia. Together with the director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective, Professor Katina Michael, we are bringing you yet another session in this series. Before we begin, we would like to thank Melissa Waite and Anna Reid for the logistical, marketing, and other support provided throughout the series. As we've heard to date in this series, the Public Interest Technology Colloquium is an opportunity to hear from our global community about the social, regulatory, ethical, and other considerations relevant to the design, the development, and also the delivery of technology in the public interest. The colloquium is underpinned by the PIT philosophy that is intended to draw people together from across disciplines to address global challenges. Public interest technology at its core requires shared meaning, which is translational. As we've said, it is to be inclusive rather than exclusive. It is also transdisciplinary while respecting the disciplines. Throughout the series, we'll be hearing from a range of speakers who'll be sharing with us their experiences and their expertise. Our guest today is Adjunct Professor Joseph R. Carvalko. We'll be hearing shortly from Professor Carvalko, after which my fellow host, Professor Katina Michael, and I will engage in discussion and reflection with our guests, followed by the opportunity for Q&A, which will be facilitated by Mr. Leon Wilson. For those of you attending live today, please feel free to write your questions in the chat window and indicate that you wish to speak during the Q&A, and we will get to your question. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker for today, Professor Joseph Carvalko. It's quite challenging, in fact, to introduce Professor Carvalko in a way that does justice to his work and to his career, but I will provide a brief overview. Professor Carvalko is a technologist, an academic, and a patent lawyer who devotes his attention to and writes about the intersection of law and technology, and much more. He chairs the Technology and Ethics Working Research Group at the Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics at Yale University. He is also an adjunct professor and course creator of Law, Science, Technology at Quinnipiac University School of Law, and he has held many academic, editorial, and other roles. As a lawyer, Professor Carvalko has been involved in scores of cases before courts and administrative agencies as a litigator. He has held positions as general counsel, top patent counsel, and law firm partner during his career. Currently, he serves as a consultant and board member to various industrial, software companies, and public entities. Professor Carvalko also worked 2 decades as an electronic technician, electrical engineer, and a programmer across a range of different areas. He has additionally authored 9 amazing books, 3 of which are academic, dealing with law, science, and the humanities, and has written numerous articles appearing in a variety of publications. In today's session, Professor Carvalko will be presenting on the topic of pharmacoelectronics, the future of medicine. Professor Carvalko maintains that much of our technology ethics conversation deals with how we manage the technology that has already invaded our lives. He feels it's important, or while it's an important consideration, it forces us to look back while we try to correct and change a technology's trajectory. In discussing how the future of medical services might play out, Professor Carvalko hopes to explore today the significance of looking ahead and thinking about questions we should be asking based on our vision. He'll be asking critical questions based on our imagined future shapes, of how our imagined future shapes the future that finally materializes. Professor Carvalko feels that the right questions might avoid many kinds of unintended consequences we experience with current technology. And with that, I'll hand over to Professor Carvalko. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Roba, and thank you for that introduction. So now I have to come back down to earth and get to the conversation that I have sort of been thinking about for some number of years. In fact, I think probably maybe 8 or 9 years ago, some long time ago, that I met Katina in Ontario at an IEEE Society and Technology conference, and I spoke about this. then. I've written a book, at least one book, if not included this sort of idea in two or three, and myself have sort of, let's say, dabbled in the biomedical patent area for some time, both as a patentee and also representing clients. So it is a subject that I keep returning back to because I just have a passion, I guess, for looking into the future. I think that's what has guided me in my career over the course of many decades now. And this one here is particularly obviously important. But that doesn't diminish the importance of other kinds of things where our science and technology has been leading us for, if not certainly decades, for centuries. So with that in mind, let me get to the presentation itself. So we're talking about pharmacoelectronics, and I'll explain to you more what that's about in a minute. And I also want to kind of, if we could, meander into the realm of what ifs as we go through this. So if you all keep in mind anyway as we go through it, well, what if this and what if that? Then I think it would be helpful to probably the discussion that I envision, following the more formal part of this presentation. So what I'm inclined to do is to present a plausible technological model that implies the direction of the delivery of future medical therapy. It's probably what every engineer does, frankly, most days in his or her life. She or he is thinking about the plausible technology that's going to be here in the future. So that's not something that's new to probably anyone on this call. And what I'd like to do is discuss how to evaluate the benefits of a system and foresee the ethical issues that might arise. Now this is different from typically, let's say, working in a development organization where you're being charged with developing a new product. This is different because this one here, in terms of what I'm about to discuss, hasn't been fully maturated or launched or deployed into society yet, right? It's a vision, and what I guess my premise is that it's our visions that have the most possible benefit. That when it comes to technology, it's within the vision that we can hopefully avoid some of the consequences that are to be avoided, once a deployment or once a product is in the marketplace. Because we can then shape the technology. We can shape it in terms of how it's used in peculiar or particular ways, and that perhaps can't venture into places where the technology would only serve to, I guess, damage human interests, for lack of a better word. We can all agree that modern technology is complex, dynamic, and which we can only begin to understand if we enable ourselves to see its structure, states of affairs, and processes as it penetrates the real world. So what I'm saying is this: that even if you're in the laboratory or you're in a development role, you've got to see what you're doing in all its form, structure, states of affairs, and processes, because many times we don't envision things in all its manifestations as it penetrates the world. For instance, give you an example: the combustion engine. Well, the combustion engine was, probably first prototyped in someone's garage. Maybe it was, maybe that person's name was Diesel. He perhaps saw the structure. And he saw the technological state of affair, but he didn't see the state of affair as to how this thing might play out in the real world. He didn't see processes that go beyond the engineering processes, but the processes of civilization or the marketplace, or all those things which are sort of outside the ken or outside the vision, typically, of an engineer. I mean, clearly, if we're putting together a computer or we're building an aircraft, yeah, we think about the immediate marketplace and the individuals or persons, okay, that are going to engage or buy the product. But then the question is, well, what beyond that? Okay, is it possible, okay, that this thing will also have an effect on things that are unintended, for instance, or persons that are unintended, or other parts of the world, nature itself that might be a victim, okay, of what it is that we're doing. And certainly the combustion engine, we can see how it has changed the world in its natural form through climate change, for instance. This is something that was particularly envisioned, okay, when this thing was first conceived, or the concept was being prototyped, or as it rolled out into the real world. We didn't see it for decades, if not more than a century. So we can never fully predict how something will evolve as it moves into the future, but we can at least create a model and hypothesize how it behaves under the influences of limited forces, limitations which we are capable of imagining in the present. And that's how this differs, because, for those of us, many of you who've been involved in product development, you're in the moment. You're getting to an objective. Typically, it's because there's someone that basically is pushing the product itself. They want to get it into the marketplace, so it has a different object, a different goal, and we often overlook those things which might be affected by it, other than those that will be our consuming public, for instance. So when we propose an idea, the question is, it's science fiction, or are we proposing something that can actually occur, that might actually occur, that has a possibility or a probability, or is this, remote, or is it impossible? Ray Bradbury, and I'm going to read this, said something along these lines, which I carry in my back pocket. Science fiction is any idea that occurs in the head and doesn't yet exist, but soon will, and will change everything for everybody, and nothing will ever be the same again. As soon as you have an idea that changes some small part of the world, you are writing science fiction. It is always the art of the possible, never the impossible. And if I lived in the late 1800s, I might have written a story predicting that strange vehicles would soon move across the landscape of the United States and would kill 2 million people in a period of 70 years. Science fiction is not the art of the possible, but of the obvious. Once the automobile appeared, you can have predicted that it would destroy as many people as it did. All right? So this is what we're talking about. That we are on the, as engineers, we're there at the front end, all right? And we have to train ourselves, or at least commit ourselves to putting something down that, frankly, will, at some future date, some future time, find its way into the public arena, okay? And the question is, well, how will it behave, or how will persons behave as toward the technology itself? In 2014, Chief Justice Roberts ruled that police officers may not, without a warrant, search digital information on a cell phone, data seized from an individual who has been arrested, stating that modern cell phones are now such a pervasive and insistent part of daily life that the proverbial visitor from Mars might conclude they were an important feature of human anatomy. And this is kind of where we're going, because with the future of medicine, for example, and Katina has written prolifically on this subject, we're finding ourselves more and more taking that technology and we're embedding it in ourselves. We started, probably, again, many centuries ago, all right, millenniums ago, in putting medication into our bodies, okay, and now we reverted to at some point of putting it in pill form. We've gone beyond that, of course. We're now putting it into our bodies in the form of digital computers, okay, to be blunt. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. So the technologies of anatomically embedded computers, which is where I'm going with some of this, or the Internet of Medical Things, which is more like IoT sensors and other kinds of more simple products, RFIDs, for instance, The smart devices that transport information from the outer world into our anatomies, like smartphones and Bluetooth, coupled with big data, which is all around the world, that have information systems that are embedded by such things as expert systems, right, that are themselves replete, okay, with artificial intelligence, and cloud services are revolutionizing health care throughout the world. Now, we might think that's science fiction. I don't think so. Right? We are on the cusp of this, and what we're going to be doing in the next hour or so is imagining how this rolls out into the world. So, future generations, we can expect sensors to alert an anatomy under assault by viruses, bacteria, pollutants, and other technologies. No question. We have the technology to do that now. Do we have the technology to alert us that we're under the assault by a COVID-19 virus? Maybe not, only because we haven't put our minds to it. But I could tell you we can do it. I mean, I am so sure of that, okay, that if I were an investor, I'd take it to the bank, right? DNA bioengineered sequences will fix genomic defects. Now, we know we're doing that. We're not doing that electronically, and we're not putting in devices in the body in order to do that. But I will suggest that it's only a matter of time. Is it 5 years, 10 years? No, I don't know. I don't have any, frankly, idea. But I don't think it's never going to happen. That we change defects in the body through some external programming source. Artificial intelligence processors will improve our integration, resilience in a techno-social world. For instance, increasing awareness and intelligence. We could talk a little bit about that. Analytical diagnostic tools to work seamlessly in concert with big data, real-time and offline, meaning essentially that we're talking about artificial intelligence really getting into the game of medical diagnosis. Right? It's already in the game. It can diagnose quicker and faster than most doctors can. All right? At some point, the doctors will let go, all right, and the machinery will take over for better or for worse. It's a matter of, putting faith in one thing or another, honestly. And once the new generations of folks come along, they will be willing to accept the computer or a machine being as good as a doctor with respect to certain things. Certainly, we have replaced the stethoscope, okay, with all kinds of electronic devices that could better gauge, okay, whether or not we're breathing right or our hearts are working right. So we've basically taken the stethoscopes and put them in faith, with some faith, put our faith in the technology that is much better at it than the doctor is. Apple Computer's Health Kit, okay, was one of the more modern forays, okay, into this realm that we're talking about. So we have smartphone technology that has health and fitness apps. Many of you probably wear those things. But we also have ways today of looking at diabetes and sending our analytics directly to hospitals, insurance companies, doctors. I have my own computer embedded in myself, and today I basically uploaded the data to my physician so he can look at it. Right? Integrate patient-generated data, using it to enable access and connectivity to patient-generated data from clinical and fitness devices. I don't know if I can do this, but I'm going to try to put us into a video here.
In a digital age, we have access to more healthcare information than ever before. The challenge is bringing it all together in one place. Enter Validic, a simple cloud-based platform that connects you to data gathered from in-home clinical devices, wearables, and healthcare apps. With the important insights and trends uncovered with data delivered by Validic, creating highly personalized healthcare experiences has never been easier. Here's how it works. First, users connect their devices and apps to the marketplace, authorizing permission for the transfer and use of their personal data. This allows Validic to gather daily activity and biometric information in real time. That data is delivered seamlessly to your system, so you control how it's displayed, analyzed, and shared. What does this mean for you? Quite simply, you'll have a more complete understanding of your population's health and habits, so you can accelerate your strategic healthcare initiatives from patient engagement and population management to care coordination, wellness programs, and more. Validics platform and mobile solutions connect you to your healthcare population like never before. We deliver all the data you need to improve health, mitigate risk, streamline costs, and better manage and engage your population. This frees up your budget and other resources so you can focus on your customers and their healthcare experiences. With Validic, healthcare data is no longer complicated. We collect so you can connect. Find the simple solution at validic.com.
So, you get the idea. I mean, that was probably a $500,000 ad, and they explained it quite well. So we're taking off, from this point. All right. So let's see. There we go. So we're talking about a closed system linking doctor, an expert system, and a patient to allow for the seamless administration of vehicle electronic signaling and drugs or other stimuli without the usual intervention of a medical service provider. The information processing component of the Pharmacoelectronics platform has the potential to analyze data, utilize AI, and achieve greater levels of treatment efficiency. So we divide this maybe into three segments: wearables and embedded computer transmitters, sensors, electrodes, stimulators, actuators, and pumps that deliver therapy and transmit measurements; network architectures, including telecommunications that interconnect devices both within the body and to the outer world; and mechanisms to program and reprogram the applications using interoperable architectures. And that's a big part of where I'm going with much of this stuff, because this is a two-way street. We're not only transmitting data to our medical provider, the medical provider is transmitting data back to us. And so that for some applications, for instance, stimulators for individuals that are suffering from perhaps Parkinson's disease, where they have a probe stuck in their brain, the medical provider can send back signals which could adjust the therapy itself, can adjust the intensity or the frequency with which that stimulation appears or works. So we're talking about a two-way street, and that is really, the complete circuit and what makes this phenomenally powerful. So pharmacoelectronics is what we're talking about: electronic sensor stimulators, telemetry, expert systems, and anatomical prosthetics, many of which are neurologically driven. Remember, the reason this works is because human beings are essentially electrochemical, entities. I mean, if we just, move out of our spiritual selves and think about us, in a more objective way, we are manifestations of electronics, electricity, and that's why this works. So this perfectly integrates, with the way in which the world is unfolding, the vision that maybe, the Edisons and Marconis of the world had a century and a half ago. So prosthetics is replacing malfunctioning, missing, damaged parts. We know that. RFID chips embedded for personal identification, integrating into the consumer supply demand chain. You see, there's a subtlety going on here. We go from what we can expect and maybe support prosthetics replacing malfunctioning to RFID chips embedded, integrating into the consumer supply chain, right? Certain demands, certain data, right, which in and of itself will affect something in that supply chain or in the data collection. And the question is, we'll talk about a little later, and perhaps we all will, as to how that filters back into the very medical care you're subjected to, that you're obtaining. Eventually, when we now have carbon-based nanoprosthetics that seek and destroy such things as cancer, can these things be electronically controlled? Yes, they can be. And they controlled from an external source? Yes, they can be. So we're looking at the applications in an anatomy. Right? Let's see. So this is sort of, a picture that appeared in the IEEE spectrum, I think about maybe 10 years ago. But at any rate, you can see the metaphor is pretty obvious. This is more than a metaphor. This is, again, something from the IEEE spectrum. We're talking about every one of these areas that you see highlighted here is now being treated with an internal device. And some of these are, again, able to communicate with the outside world. The question is, to what extent do many of these actually communicate bilaterally or with the outside world? In other words, is it a communication that's going both ways? The simplified diagram, again, is that you have a device inside the body. You have a phone, router, whatever, local tower, the internet, the server, data processing. And what makes much of that now, frankly, more possible, let's say, than it was 10 years ago, is that computers, and we know, are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. We're talking about chip sizes at 5 nanometers. Okay, that is about 100 atoms wide. We're talking about upwards of 30 billion transistors, right, in the size of in your cell phone, right? But the processor itself is probably the size of your thumbnail. So we're talking about phenomenal increases and improvements, okay, in our technological capacity, not to mention 5G technology, okay, which now has bandwidths, okay, which can support massive populations. We're talking about large data structures, okay, with artificial intelligence, which over the last several years has phenomenally improved in terms of its capacity or capability, okay, for making associations. There's a pill now that you can, your doctor can prescribe. It's about 27 by 11 millimeters, so it's a little long, but nonetheless, it's probably like some big horse pills that my doctor has prescribed for me from time to time. And it's filled with a liquid, perhaps, and it's connected to a wireless data exchange and a stepper motor. This is the pill itself now. All right. So within the pill, you have a wireless data exchange communication system and a stepper motor. And the stepper motor runs to control the amount of release of the drug in your body. This exists, right? Has existed for the last 7 years. This can be done external, this can be controlled externally, of course. This is something that just came on the market this past several months. For those individuals that have sleep apnea, they can now have this generator put in place, and there's a stimulator lead that goes to some nerve in and around the throat, and there's a breathing sensor lead that determines when your breathing kind of stops or gets sort of nasty, and it controls your sleep apnea, so that people can literally die, I guess, if it gets out of control, and it replaces that CPAP, that big sort of oxygen mask that people around the world have to wear to basically make sure that they can wake up the next morning. We're all familiar with the Cochlear Implant by now. This is a small pacemaker. You can see it's the size of a nickel, an American nickel, and it's inserted through the arteries, and it lodges itself in the interstices of the heart, and it's controlled electronically externally. Right? So it can transmit to your doctor. The MyCareLink smart monitor for pacemaker patients combines a reader and an app, making this a convenient way to send heart information remotely, and something I have on my shelf. It looks like that, actually. And you put the device near your heart, and it transmits. Takes about 2 minutes. All right, and your doctor has a full idea of every heartbeat that has manifested from the time the device was installed, it could be 20 years worth of heartbeats, believe it or not. Electronic chips in medication exist. This is what we talked about just a few minutes ago. There's some for sleep. There's some for heart patients. There's some to control your weight, and you can go on and on and on. There are pain management systems that are available. Here's one that every so often I keep going to the artificial heart websites to see how advanced they are. They were pretty lousy, or not well. They weren't well advanced. Let's put it that way. I shouldn't say lousy. Well advanced 10 years ago, but today they're actually installing these devices in patients. I think Europe has approved it through their equivalent of the U.S. Federal Federal FDA, and the EC has approved its use. And so there are people alive today that are using this device. And again, you can see that it's easily controlled through an external communication if need be. We'll be looking at some point in the future at chromatography on a chip. Well, it exists now. The question is, how small can they make it, and when they can make it and analyze the kinds of things that chromatographs are used for, which is oftentimes things like blood or fluid analytics. It could well be used to inform doctors as to the kinds of things that they only get when you go to a laboratory and have blood drawn or urine taken or some other fluid, okay, that they analyze. We are aware that there are such things as contraceptive implants, and that could be controlled externally. Brain implants, there's a whole bunch of work going on in this area. Elon Musk, I guess, has stepped into it. And he now is running quite a significant operation for brain implants. And these, of course, are just ripe, okay, for communication to an external world. And you can almost, again, sort of imagine, and more than in a scientific fiction sense, as to where this one's going. There are other things that are occurring. For instance, there are artificial biological cells being created. Synthetic biology is moving into this field or this realm, and I'm not going to speak much about that at this point because it would just take too long to get into that. So let me sort of take a breath. All right, and let's say that's pretty much what it was that I wanted to introduce you all to, for the sake of talking about again a somewhat hypothetical system, because I am proposing a hypothetical system. But as a patent lawyer, I can tell you, I mean, I have serviced hundreds of clients, patent clients. I myself, have been involved in technology for many decades as a patent. As an inventor and also as a developer of product. We're always thinking about the future, okay, when we do these things, right? Inventors are always thinking about the future. They don't know if most of them don't know if what they've put down on paper and what I could perhaps get a patent for is actually going to really work or find its way into the marketplace. Only a few percent actually do. What I have determined, however, in the course of working that side of that side of law, is that technology is often very specific in terms of what its implications are for society. It's always very specific as to what its implications are in terms of how it can fail. And I'm not saying anything that you all don't already know, right? A bridge and the things that can go wrong in construction of a bridge or design of a bridge are very different from the things that can go wrong in the design of a computer or the design of an engine. And one of the problems that I think we've had, and I've thought about this some because as the chair of the Tech and Ethics group, I've wondered how is it that we can come up and develop a system of ethics, okay, where we could, basically roll out this idea, this ethical idea, with prescriptions and maxims and mandates and whatnot so that it works, okay, for the very thing that's under the microscope at the time. I've come to the conclusion it's not possible. In law, I can, in my early career, the first 8 or 10 years, I was a litigator, and there was something called proof of facts. It's a library that I purchased as a lawyer, upstart lawyer. I forgot what it cost back when I started, but it was not cheap. But it went from A to Z. It went from airplane to zebra, all right? And in those books, which was, it was a whole library, with each one of those headings, like like an encyclopedia, it told you what you needed to do in order to prove that particular thing that was under examination failed or was the causation behind someone's injury. Everyone was very specific. And so, yeah, there might have been some similarities between a 10-story building and a bridge in terms of structure, all right? But by and large, we're talking about different things. So when we talk about tech ethic issues, think about what is the class of technology under investigation, because that'll give you a sign as to which road to take in order to do your analysis. There are no magic bullets. There are no silver bullets, right, in this case. But again, if I were to now think about this more broadly and step back over 50,000 feet, it generally runs something like this. There's misfeasance, all right? We know that, negligently responsible for causing harm. And we see that, for instance, in things like nuclear reactors, okay? We saw this at 3 Mile Island, okay? We saw this in the Bhopal, okay, chemical factory, okay, which killed hundreds of thousands of people ultimately in India, 1987, I think, all right? The Challenger, all right? Disaster, okay? I had the good fortune of working with Roger Beaujolais, who was one of the engineers on that. I worked with him for 2 years on a case in Switzerland, actually, on a technology case. Phenomenally prescient individual and one with great insights into these things. But we're talking about misfeasance, malfeasance, knowingly acting to cause harm. Well, right now we're, I don't want to, put too fine a point on it, but, we may be under nuclear threat, all right? That's malfeasance, knowingly acting to cause harm, because what? The individual behind the curtain is thinking about using a nuclear weapon on a cruise missile. I can tell you that I worked on tracking systems that ultimately found their way into the cruise missile. Did I imagine then as a technician or as an engineer, I think it was an engineer then, that I would be working on something that maybe today would take my life many decades later? No. But this is the kind of insights, okay, that one must have. And I'll get to that point in a minute. Nonfeasance, intentional failure or refusal to fulfill one obligation. This happens a lot because when I was in development, I worked in aerospace for several years. I worked in the United States Air Force, right, as a technician. I was 10 feet away from the atomic bomb all the time. I wasn't going to raise my hand and say, I'm out of here, right? I went along with the program, right? Intentional failure or refusal to fulfill one obligation. Well, what kind of obligation are we talking about? A moral obligation? Yeah, I think so. I think that has to be included in this, all right? So there are a lot of things, okay, that we look at these words, misfeasance, malfeasance, nonfeasance, but what do they mean to us as individuals, and how can we relate those to things that actually have happened in the real world? And now how will or could they play out in the thing we're looking at now, which is a little more than science fiction? Unanticipated dual use. Oftentimes, this one I mentioned about the tracking system that now found its way into the cruise missile, that's a dual use. We were using it to take pictures around the moon, okay? We were hired by NASA to develop a tracking system to reduce the blur of the photographs they were taking. So it was called a V/H sensor, so that the panning rate, okay, could be held constant while pictures were being taken. All right? Ultimately, that same tracking system was used in the cruise missile to find its way to its intended target. Now, maybe today cruise missiles use GPS, probably do. In the early days, it didn't. So, Other examples. I worked 8 years as general counsel to the Farrell Corporation. We made processors, reactors, okay, for making plastics, and we sold them all over the world. Lo and behold, we get a notice from the Defense Department that these may be dual-use machinery used to make weapons of mass destruction. Right? I woke up one morning and I'm driving to work and I hear a broadcast that somehow, I think either it was Bush or Clinton, I think it was Bush, was sending aircraft over Libya to bomb sites which were using these kinds of reactors to make weapons of mass destruction. All right? My heart was in my throat because when I got to the office, what I expected was to meet with FBI agents wanting to know why we sold these products to Libya. Fortune would have it that these were reactors that Libya had purchased from the Germans. All right? Well, you can see how this works, right? And how you become entangled, right, in these things, innocently. Combinational integration. This is where, and this is very much like what we're talking about here. We're talking about a technology, pharmacoelectronics, which is combinational integration. It's the combination of embedded technology, computers, telecommunications, big data systems, and we're talking about the medical community and artificial intelligence. And you can go on. I mean, I will leave it to you to explore, in your own imagination, all of the different ways in which combinational integration is involved in this. All right? And it may someday be a dual-use kind of entity because what? Because this very stuff that we're talking about, these pharmacoelectronics, can be used to enhance human performance. So the next one is unforeseen events, war, and nature. So I put this out there because for a discussion, we really need to talk about this. And it occurs to me that, let me just do something here. Yeah. Roba, can you give me a time check, please?
You can go for possibly another 10, Joe, if that's okay. We're happy to hear you speak, so we'll adjust after you finished your talk.
Yeah,
So go ahead, even beyond the 10 minutes, and we'll adjust with Leon accordingly. Thank you, Joe.
All right. Here's what I think, okay, we lack. And again, this is from 50,000 feet. A lack of imagination of the possible unintended consequences of a technology to wreak havoc on a population or nature. One of the things that I think, again, and it's no criticism really of engineers, and I can say this about lawyers too. After all, I'm both an engineer and a lawyer, or professors of any kind. I mean, so this is across the broad spectrum. We get very, very focused on what it is that we're doing, right? And we lack imagination, okay, outside of a particular menu of possibilities. And I think that as engineers, especially, and as lawyers or as teachers, we have to expand our imagination and think of things and bring them to the fore. No one's going to be critical. You're not going to be criticized for it. But the real leaders in this world are ones that could look outside, could jump outside the box. Okay, and yes, there'll be criticism. There'll be people and there'll be pundits that say you're crazy or it can't possibly be done or you shouldn't be thinking that way. Right? We have a lack of critical thinking and formal process that considers the potential injury to stakeholders of its misuse, dual use, or the trajectory of a product or process. For some years, I was the manager of new products for Pitney Bowes Copier Systems products. We never thought about, did any critical thinking other than critical thinking about the product itself and how fast it ran, how well it made copies, things like that. But lo and behold, we didn't consider the fact that one of our products that we developed used xenon arc lamps to fuse the toner to the paper. And when they got stuck, right, when the paper got stuck in the machine, the paper came out flaming, right, and then it went into a basket where poor copies were generally put, And then the basket caught on fire. We were selling these things to hospitals and schools. So you see how this thing sort of moves. We never thought about critically thinking about who it was that was going to buy these things, like schools or anywhere else that where fires, would be absolutely catastrophic. In fact, we didn't think about the fact that there might even be a fire, right? Until we started seeing these fires all over the place. A lack of acknowledging motivations, altruisms, egos, biases, conflicts of interests, the diffusion of moral authority and development or use that results in disregard of normative ethical principles. These are the kind of things that, frankly, I never really thought through as a lawyer. I certainly have thought it through as an engineer. I didn't think it through. I think it through as a lawyer all the time, all right? Because when I'm going in to prosecute a case or defend a case, typically I'm on the prosecution side. I'm thinking about, well, what were the motivations of these people, all right? What was, who within an organization basically was responsible? Is there a diffusion of moral authority, or is it a lot of it just sort of speak, all right, corporate speak? They make it sound right, but there's really nobody, who's like the vice president of moral authority, all right, for a corporation or an institution. So none of the following types of practices precede the deployment of engineered technology. What I'm driving at here is that there are organizations out there that do look ahead. All right? Engineering of technology typically isn't one of them. The military invents and plays war games all the time. So they try to imagine, in effect, what can go wrong. Law students engage in moot court and litigation lawyers assemble mock jurors before trying important cases. I've done that to see what could go wrong. Right? Sellers assemble panels to research and ascertain if product advertisement will succeed. Great. They certainly didn't do that for Facebook. Right? Pharmaceutical companies test new drugs in stages with representative populations to test efficacy. And IRBs evaluate plans for conducting humans and animal experimentation against ethical norms, finally. All right? Took a long time coming. So it's not like this, much of this stuff sort of is, well worn, has been out there for like a century. We're still, as engineering developers, still trying to find our way, because why? Much of it is, frankly, being the bestest firstest, all right? So we need to decide if any institution or individual should have the right to exclusive ownership of the technology we're talking about. Let me now revert, I think, to pharmacoelectronics more particularly. So in what we saw a few minutes ago, maybe 20 minutes ago, in terms of this proposed pharmacoelectronic system, we might ask the question, should any individual or institution have the right to exclusive ownership of certain forms of pharmacoelectronic property, life-saving devices, selected methods of extending life and enhancing intelligence or skills? Now, I might say that, well, you're being Pollyannish because, we're living in a capitalist society, and therefore there's always going to be someone who basically will give us the best if there's a profit motive, all right? Well, maybe we've got to think that through, because maybe that isn't true, all right? Maybe we could still get the best without it having a profit motive as the carrot, at the end of the stick. I don't know. All right? I'm not that wise, all right? But I do think that unless we ask the question, we're not going to get there. Whether open sourcing software should become the preferred paradigm, Who will operate the service and the databases, the pricing, access? Will it be the pharmaceutical companies? Well, they'll try for sure. What licensing restrictions will be allowed for internal software? Can you get updates? Should get updates. Will you be forced updates? Like today, my iPhone was updated about 20 minutes before I had to be online here. And I used my iPhone for my camera. I mean, who figured that out? Why didn't, isn't there something that, says, Mr. Carvalko is going to use his phone to basically talk to an important group of guests? No, all right? They just do it. So future computational telemetry processing therapies might go beyond health-related purposes. And this is a big one. because it always has the potential, okay, to basically improve one's intellect or have access to commercial opportunities, and who will be the beneficiaries. So we got to think about those kinds of things. And again, I'm not as qualified as a group would be to basically put forth in a brainstorming session all the reasons and things that all the things we should be talking about here. Right? Will AI be programmed with something that replaces free will? So when you're talking about brain downloads or brain type interfacing, for instance, we've got to very seriously consider whether or not these things will be basically run by somebody behind the curtain, all right? Or will, the person have a kill switch, that they can basically go back to normal. Maybe they don't want to go back to normal. I mean, television has that effect on me sometimes. I can't stop watching it because it's magnetic, right? So you can imagine if they keep giving you the opium, okay, of a good pulse, you're not going to want to let it go. Right? Part of what will distinguish the future human population having implanted computational devices connected to the web from a population that does not will be the enhancement that opens vast benefits for the haves and the consequent potential for detriments for the have-nots. And the reason I say that maybe twice or more than once, because that seems to be the bane of humanity, right? So he's somebody who wants to be on top. So we got regulatory considerations. We have to think about criminal laws. We have to think about other kinds of civil laws and civil actions, okay, and things having to do with contract law, product liability law, warranty law, things that are, frankly, not popular, or not popular, I should say popular, but just not something that is all that interesting to a lot of people, but nonetheless are important considerations. So anyway, that's it, and these are two books that I'd written on this subject, more or less. That one there with the help of a couple of people, a couple of our guests here, who are readers and commentators. So at any rate, let me stop there, Roba, and turn the session back over to you.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was such a rich presentation covering so many areas, so many concepts, and really the challenges that need to be addressed in thinking about the future. I would like to invite Katin to provide some reflections in a moment before we hand over to Leon too. But first, I have a few observations, Joe, after hearing your talk, and an initial question, or really it's a series of questions, but I will choose one. I think your presentation, in addition to doing so many other things, so eloquently expressed how a range of both emerging and existing technologies, as they converge together, are revolutionizing healthcare, but also spoke to a broader series of concepts about law, technology, the nature of engineering, and just so much more. Katina and I have often explored and thought about how we transition in an ethical and responsible manner to these future modes. So when we're thinking about the revolutions and particular application areas, so these future modes of operation. And we've come to several conclusions about how this transition might work. So one, Joe, is about the necessity of encouraging multi and transdisciplinary collaborations and the nature of these collaborations in tech ethics discussions. So my question is, as an engineer, lawyer, technologist, academic, and so much more, I believe you're in a prime position to comment about this. So how do we balance a range of human interests when we engage multiple disciplines in discussion? So we're engaging multiple disciplines. We're also thinking it, as you suggested toward the latter part of your talk, about social, political, regulatory, and other concerns and interests. So how do we bring this all together in thinking and directing our attention to the future, particularly given, Joe, that you mentioned some of these systems have the potential, and I quote what you said here, to damage human interests. Do you have suggestions or thoughts about how we can go about this in practice? How do we start envisaging the future with multiple disciplines and interests in mind?
Yeah. It's a wonderful question, and it's an interesting concept. How do you bring? And I think you begin by acknowledging that there are diverse interests, right? So that if anything like that will work, it works because you invite the diverse interests, some of which are antithetical to the ideas that we've talked about here. but nonetheless have to be persuaded, right, to adopt frankly, some premises about how it is that we want the future to look for not only ourselves, but for humanity, and maybe more personally, for our children, for our grandchildren. I mean, you have to find the place that we can all agree that we want to reach, all right? And even though that our motivation today may be one thing, if we were thinking more ideally, we would probably all have to admit that 2 or 3 generations from now, we would want the world to look like what? Right? And if we could construct or fabricate, or again amongst ourselves, or whatever the group is, what the world should look like, right, at that point in time, and we can agree to that, then perhaps we have some chance of coming back to today, right, and thinking about what needs to occur in order for that to be the way in which the way the future looks or appears to us. I think that at least is one thought that comes quickly to mind, that you have to project your not only the technology into the future, but you have to project humanity into the future. How do you want it to look? How do you want it to be? And we can, there's all these, sort of idealized sort of concepts. Yeah, we want, peace amongst everybody. All right, okay, all right, let's start there. But I think that you can work your way down a list of things that become much more definable, frankly. Not just saying peace. How does the world live? Okay, there's, unfortunately, I think, is that, we're not helped by our ideas about what political system to accept, or what economic system to accept, or what moral system to accept. There are religious constraints, there are political constraints, and there are cultural constraints. I mean, those are 3 biggies. But we also know that there have been successes in bringing about change in places we never would have imagined. South Africa is a good example, for instance, right? And I'm sure we all could, if we thought hard about it, you make a little list, okay, of things that we could never have imagined would transcend those boundaries of culture, of religion, of animosities and biases and prejudices. But yet it happened. So anyway, I think that's step number 1. I don't think you can begin to imagine how this could occur unless you begin to think about what are the examples of other things that may have succeeded, that necessitated the involvement of people who had widely differing points of view and immediate objectives or goals.
So much to think about there, Joe, and I have so many ideas swirling in my mind that I'd love to ask you, but I do want to hear from Katina and others as well, and maybe we can have discussions. I'm hoping we can have discussions into the future about some of these ideas and concepts, but I like that as a practical starting point, thinking about broadly where we're headed and how we can, as you said, develop something tangible to work towards within the scope of that larger picture, that larger vision. Katina, I'd love to hear from you some reflections on Joe's talk and anything else you'd like to share.
Well, weren't we spoiled today, Roba and Guess, with Joe's talk? And you always set the foundations, Joe, and Roba, your question was so important. It sets the scene really for question time and reflections, Roba. I wrote something down, we are a heartbeat. You said something, Joe, and I wrote it down, but it inferred we are a heartbeat, each one of us. Without that heart beating, we don't exist, right? We're not here, we're not physically here, nor over the internet. And that micro to macro scale, we went from the heartbeat right to this big picture in our view of what do we want the world to be. It's almost like we are the individuals who are a system in ourselves, but we are working in a larger system and a larger system. And Robo and I often talk about that system of systems. Are we able to better model? And as you said, what are our hypotheses for a particular technology? How will it behave? MG Michael was right next to me throughout most of your talk, and he's asked a question. He's a bit under the weather this morning, and he's wearing a mask, so he can't appear. But he says, is dual use possibly engineered as a hidden function in some technology? Is it a function creep to begin with? Is it preemptively built in? And how do we interpret this? Is it there by default? And we perhaps don't see it, but is it there embedded to begin with? Just like planned obsolescence, he adds. I kept thinking, Joe, about THX 1138, the science fiction film. I also kept thinking about something you established a long time ago. You know, we were having a discussion once upon a time, and you said, Katina, why aren't there ethics applications in the patent process? And I said, Joe, that's a great idea. We should tell the Food and Drug Administration and should go around telling every other therapeutic goods administration in the world, why not? So we test for inventiveness in the patent process, but we don't test for ethics. And managing tech, opening comments from Robo, and inspired by your bio and your work, your life work. How do we tame the beast? How do we manage tech, or is it managing us? There's some of my initial thoughts, but I wanted, Joe, to introduce you to someone very special. Everyone on this call is special, but I met Erin Chewy when I arrived in Arizona State University. We ended up on a National Science Foundation grant together. And Erin's a specialist in human systems engineering and has a few words to add in context. So I might introduce her before we hear some reflections from you, Joe.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm an assistant professor of human systems engineering at Arizona State University. Katina asked me to give a very brief introduction of what it is that we do. And I do see a lot of overlap, especially with some of the ideas that you mentioned. So there's something about whether or not this is science fiction, because I have at one point described to my students what it is that I do. I basically imagine future scenarios based on what engineers are saying that they're building. And then we do various methods of this, like there's a Wizard of Oz method where you can have a researcher behind a curtain pretending to be, the technology, and you have humans interact with it and you see how they respond. And so that's really the area that I live in. So I feel very inspired to hear, your sort of call to arms in terms of what we need to be thinking about in this new technology space. And so I did have, this is actually a slide that I had cut from a previous presentation that I gave, but I hope it might give a very concise overview of what human systems engineering is. So it's an engineering discipline that merges human factors and ergonomics, broadly defined, with systems engineering. And so my background, I actually did my undergrad in psychology and philosophy, and then did my PhD in industrial and systems engineering. And most of my colleagues are cognitive scientists. And that differs a bit from human systems integration, which is a philosophy and set of processes that focus on systems level human performance concerns throughout a system's life cycle. And its purpose is to mitigate the risk of downstream system failure. So you talked about reducing harm, that wonderful slide with different types of harms. Yeah, it's a wonderful framework. And I think along the same lines of the things that people in my field are interested in. And talking about the different technological models, that's exactly the space that I'm working in, which is sometimes a little bit difficult to translate into engineering, which you must know. How do you merge all of these various complicated social psychological factors with actual system design? And so in my work specifically, so this is not necessarily what all human systems engineers do, but in engineering, we have this very common and predominant arrangement of humans and technology together, where there's hard or formal controls. You want technology that's predictable. You want to enforce certain behaviors. You want self-governing entities. So, a technology that's completely self-governing and a human entity that's completely self-governing. Otherwise, you involve a human supervising the technology, which we know from many studies that humans are terrible monitors of technology, especially the higher performing technology that it is. And in the space that I work, it is looking at trust in technology. And so the way that we've thought about that with these self-governing ways of thinking about things is, do people trust the technology appropriately? And so the ways that I'm trying to push the bounds of how do we design for humans in a way that is, I think, doesn't reduce them to, and I think this is probably getting at your statement about not agreeing on the political, economic, or moral systems. So there's certainly a lot of values embedded in the way that I approach this. But, you know, if we have software informal controls, or we look at what happens when you have two systems interacting and what are the emergent outcomes of that, can we influence in a positive way, you know, designed to be more relational, where the technology is responsive to human needs, especially, you know, with increasingly capable technology and artificial intelligence. Rather than thinking about supervision, could we take a more cooperative approach and moving beyond appropriate trust, where you're calibrating people's trust to the capabilities of technology? Could you consider the entire life cycle of the technology so that it develops trusting relationships, not just with individuals, but also with communities? So that's my brief spiel, and I you know, really appreciate your talk. I learned so much, and look forward to following up on some of your other work.
You're definitely on the right track, and so, and your colleagues, and this the whole idea, similar to what you were driving at here, but in a very different context. When I first started practicing law, I was as I said, a litigator, and I was obviously fascinated with how jurors make decisions, and decided to study psychology and put my thoughts down in a very large manuscript. And it dealt with, or had to deal with, the fact that you're bringing people in from different quarters as jurors with different points of view with respect to the very individual and crime that was committed, or being alleged to have been committed. So you have the crime that has been alleged to be committed, where people have their own special biases about that. And then you have the individual themselves, where people aren't, you know, without their own prejudices. And how do you deal with these 12 individuals who now have to come together for one common purpose that you stress and you hope they all can agree with, and that is justice? You see? So that's an example of where you can focus in on one thing that all these diverse personalities and biases and prejudices agree with, right? What is justice? Now, it can run afoul, because there may be some people who believe that justice is hanging somebody from a tree, all right? And, you know, we know that that kind of justice has been around, still is around. But for the most part, you know, most people in the world we know, at least I know, don't behave that way. They can be at least rational when it comes to defining what justice means, all right? A punishment, okay, which is not cruel and unusual if it turns out that they were convicted or that they're set free, right? So I don't know what the analogy is for what you're doing, but I don't think it's far off in terms of the kind of problem that you're dealing with, the structure of the problem. I think that's analogous. Getting to Michael's question, this dual use, it brings to mind, and I think he's got a very good idea there, but it brings to mind Anne Colloquium, all right, where Anne's idea is that you build in, all right, security into the software, for example, all right, so that the software can only work a certain way, all right, in terms of security and privacy. And so, to the extent that you could do that with software is something I can imagine is feasible, right? That piece of it I can accept. How you actually design that into something that is hard, right? and maybe like a bridge or a car engine, for instance, is more more complicated, I think. I don't know how, for instance, I would design a pressure cooker, right? That makes great stew from that same pressure cooker that could be used to make a bomb. Right? That's more complicated.
Thank you so much, Joe, for those reflections. And Erin, we're delighted that you could join us today and share with us some of your work. It sounds absolutely fascinating, and we can certainly see the overlap when we're talking about ideas of values, of justice, and where Joe's reflection ended off here about the by design frameworks. So how we work within the realm of by design when you're talking about these complex, use the word, Joe, complex, dynamic, systems. You brought in supply chains, and as complexity increases, so too does, I guess, the way that we need to the frameworks that we require to approach ideas of justice and values. I do want to pause there for a moment and hand over to Mr. Leon Wilson to moderate our next segment of Q&A. Thank you, Leon. Over to you.
Oh, great. Thank you, Dr. Robbins. Okay, yep, turned it over to me. So this has been great, and I've been writing more than listening, or listening more than writing, or trying to do both at the same time, dual use. But I definitely, while I like to make sure there's time for Melissa and Jason and Mohammed and others to ask other questions, I do have one question or thought, because again, as you talk about, thinking ahead and about dual use, there's always that term. I always reminded of Amira's Law. And if you know Amira's Law, it's a concept that we always underestimate. We overestimate technology during its formative years, and we underestimate it in its latter years. And that's how we're throttling up and down. And when we're talking about like human systems engineering, when we're talking about ethical use of these technologies, trying to embed that or incorporate that, I'm always reminded, especially as a practitioner, about the question of we're focused on what the technology is and can do versus who the technology is doing it to. And now that turns to questions from ethics to equity. And when you talk about ethics, it's about, undermining civil society. But when you're talking about equity, you're talking about basically restricting who has access to things and things of that nature. And should we be thinking about that just as much about equity? I'm concerned about these sorts of technologies as far as the use of them. As I said, I was in the military. Is it, if I re-enlisted, are they just going to shove one of these gadgets down my throat, just like they loaded me up with a bunch of immunization shots without my permission? And for those that are incarcerated, will it be imposed upon them as far as governing their activities, or will they still have some form of free will? So we talk a lot about ethics and so forth, but I also want to make sure we also that was a conversation with these kind of technologies when you talk about use and who's it going to be used upon when it pertains to equity for the use of that. And will it be accessible to those? And are we designing these things at the lowest common denominator of who's it available for, or are we always designing at the highest denominator, the lowest denominator, the highest denominator, and then hoping that other people will just get on board? So those are my comments and commentary, but I would welcome your thoughts on that and you started talking about the unintended consequences or unanticipated dual use, because as mankind, we're very creative creatures. Yes, we're a heartbeat, but we're creative creatures with billions of neurons running through our brains. And to be able to control the ways we would think about using a gadget or device, or trying to or jimmy rig it to do something differently out of pure necessity in developing countries and things of that nature. Can you elaborate a little bit more about, again, where I was talking about, where it's about equity and the accessibility of these kind of things, but keep in mind about this issue about dual use?
Yeah, let me read you the closing paragraph on a paper that I've just submitted to the law school. And it goes something like this. Let's remember that as pharmacoelectronics advances toward becoming an accepted medical treatment regime, one that extends lifetimes and enhances medical well-being, it may fail as a proverbial silver bullet for fixing the hard problems, a significant but partial list which includes overpopulation, famine, and the persistent lack of health care throughout much of the world. We need not go far before we see signs that human-centered technology fails to reach many throughout the world. On this last point, we end with a question. In those corners of the world now coming into the age of the internet, those corners where people have been historically deprived of modern health care, will they now discover an accessible upgrading of health care brought about by a responsible pharmacoelectronic paradigm, internet-like, one with the power to change lives for the better? So you have to ask yourself, how do I weigh this? Is it possible that if we were to do this, right, and I think we are going to do it, will it actually inure, to the benefit of some of those societies which have historically been denied? Now, our success or our track record for providing internet services to people in deprived communities or native communities in particular in the United States, and I'm sure it's probably this way throughout the world, don't have access to the internet, all right? Will they have access to the internet 10 years from now or 20 years from now? I can't tell you because I don't have a crystal ball. But it may well be that in a future day, 20, 30, 40 years, that maybe this is, I don't say a panacea, but maybe it actually does solve problems that have been difficult here. Finding a doctor, I lived part of my year in New Mexico, in a small town with about 500 people. I'm 30 miles from the nearest 30 miles from the nearest clinic, and about 85 miles from the nearest hospital of any merit. We just don't get care in places like that. Anyway, just a point.
Great response, and I'm seeing a lot of chatter on the chat. But I'll open up the floor to others who want to ask a particular question or to give a thought or comment. And I'll be mindful. I used to teach at a university, and I had a 3-second rule that if there were 3 seconds of silence, then I keep talking.
Well, you had asked an earlier question, and I unfortunately, I guess I forgot exactly what it was, but it dealt with dual use.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what was the core of that again, Leon?
Well, it was kind of building off of what was already mentioned about dual use, where the question was asked about, well, can you program it in, or can you control or restrict? And you start talking about, well, put it in security so that the tool can only do one thing. But then we talk about this more from a regulatory standpoint, it is a device. So if you're using this device outside of the guidelines of what we propose it to be, then does that violate the warranty? Then if something does happen, then how does that fall in place from a legislative standpoint?
Right. And let me just say this again, I haven't thought this through, like a lot of things I talk about. But one thing I might think about, there may be something along the lines of like a blockchain that accompanies every implement, that is part of this system. And so that unless the blockchain is satisfied, all right, then you can't work outside the system. It's highly regulated, by virtue of the fact that you've got a way of tracking, right? Which incidentally is not something that's new in engineering. One of our biggest problems when you're making a product that both for the military and for consumer use is tracking, right? Tracking the changes, all right? And we did it successfully, for airplanes and radar and other things that were important to, let's say, NASA or the Air Force. There's no reason why one could not do it in this kind of a system, but it would have to be developed or designed from the very beginning, all right, as being construed or constricted, by that set of, that regimen. All right.
Again, any other questions or comments?
I might jump in if I can, Leon.
Please.
Joe, lovely to see you again, as always.
Same here, Jason.
Sage advice, always welcomed. You're one of our revered leaders, so I just hope people tell you that and you get to know that. There's a lot that came up just quickly about what Leon's question was, and that got me thinking where you mentioned Anne, privacy by design. And one of the issues I have here is I don't have enough time in my semester to teach enough ethics, I think, to my graduates before they go out. And we've talked through a lot of our sort of friends and family, Matt Mitka and others who come into these events, about how do we fix that problem. But one of the primary purpose of the data collected, that's what it should be used for. So when we think about the secondary uses, it's a bit like that problem we have with data that's collected but should only be used for the primary, but it's used for a secondary or a third purpose. I've recently followed Ian Kerr on LinkedIn. I'm not sure if you know Ian, but he's into design thinking, engagement, and things like that. And he was sort of talking about that we need to know what we do not want to do. So designing systems, that's sort of stepping ahead of where we should be. And he's saying empathy shouldn't be the start. It should be all about engagement and the process of engaging. So just maybe get some quick thoughts about that. I love the term Pollyannish, so I'll steal that from you and use that in some of my classes. That was really good. And to MG's point, I think the sort of devil on the shoulder would say, that's okay. Dual uses, we're extracting as much value out of that as we can. But is it ethical? That's the other sort of angel on the shoulder saying, no, it's not. So they're just some things that I put down, maybe some quick thoughts, but really good to see you and hope you keep well.
Thank you. So you raised this idea of empathy, and empathy on the part of the engineer. Is that what we're dealing with here? The individual who's actually behind the design or part of the design team? Is that where the empathy is that you were describing? Yeah. Yeah,
that's what he was referring to, the sort of
sure. Yeah,
where design science is meant to be the panacea of the jumping off point, and considering everybody, he's saying empathy is normally the starting point, but he believes it should be around the engagement process first.
Yeah, well, we're fighting sort of two things here. One is the rational, right? And we engineers, lawyers, whatever, we tend to like to live that way. Okay, in a world where things are well structured, we could bring critical thinking to the solution to problems. And the other side of it is irrational. In other words, like the amygdala. The amygdala doesn't have, right, a sense of rationality. That doesn't mean that it's not important, because we all live by virtue of our emotions, by virtue of our empathy, essentially. And so it really takes, again, an understanding and to talk about to, I would think, others, our children and our students, whomever will listen, that, there are these things, and both of them have to be sort of used in responsible ways. But I think, as important as it is to an engineer to be a critical thinker in the way of, processes and procedures and flowcharts and, mathematics, they also have to have as much training or develop skills that are the irrational side, because that is what is imposing on that other work that they're doing all the time. So I just think that we've given it we separated these things as if they were like two different worlds, that someone who goes into the social sciences or goes into social work has no place, in the world of engineers, for example. That's not my, I don't think that that's the way it should be. In fact, I think every design team, needs to have the philosopher. I've said this before, or the poet. I've said that before, right? And I keep repeating it because I think they have as much to offer. They've thought about empathy, they've thought about compassion, and they've thought about all these things, that are essential, to our humanity, and more essential, honestly, than the technology. All right, we can live without the technology. We can't live without the other stuff. All right. anyway, just a point of view.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Jason. That actually talks to a question that I had, Joe, and I might just sort of finish up on that question reflection. Something you said in your talk, looking ahead is typically what engineers do. You also mentioned something about that often this results in not seeing the complete picture. And as Jason was talking, I was thinking about the educational element here. So how do we encourage engineers, I guess, to see the elements outside that vision that you spoke about that they're typically working within, so beyond the engineering processes? And I think partly here, there's a specific role that higher education institutions play here to integrate systems thinking, but even beyond systems thinking, just consideration of that bigger picture to allow for complexity and the dynamic nature of these evolving, that dynamic nature of these ecosystems to be incorporated. In your opinion and experience, what could educational institutions do to encourage engineers to think outside the box, to see the complete picture, and to recognize the importance of thinking about philosophy, integrating these other disciplines back to the earlier point? Do you see there's anything sort of tangible that can be done in terms of integration to existing curricula, for example? Sort of talking to Jason's point as well.
I did a search not too long ago of the various engineering colleges around the country that actually required ethics as one of the subjects, right, before graduation. I didn't really find much. I wasn't all that successful. All right, that even where, like MIT, for instance, has looked like a good course, I don't think it was a requirement. Right? Now there are. When I say a requirement, there obviously is a requirement for taking courses in English or philosophy or whatever, because we all did that, I'm sure. You know, I remember taking English courses and philosophy courses, but not the kind of courses that we're talking about, ones that have an impact on the technology itself. You know, I mean, when I took philosophy, and I'm sure maybe it's changed, but, you know, we do study the classics. You know, we study the Greek philosophers, and then we studied the philosophers of the, 17, 1800s, Kant or Kierkegaard or whatever it might be, all right? But we don't study today, okay, what is the manner in which we should be approaching and using this idea, okay, of integrating humans, right, into the design process. That in and of itself is, to me, a subject that should not only should be taught, should be required, right, of engineers. And they shouldn't just take it because it's like, they just take it because, okay, I got to, it's sort of a requirement, I just got to check it off. There should be more to it than that. It should be something that they have to ponder, okay. Lawyers have a better shot at that and have integrated that into their curriculums. And of course, they're talking about human behavior all the time. Unfortunately, as we see in the product of the practice of law, like in our country, some people never got the message, all right? So, that has to be dealt with as well. So merely taking a course may not be the end all. But, good teachers could make the difference. And even though we have a course, it's not the course, okay, that influences the student as much as it is the person who's delivering the message, And so maybe those people that are chosen to teach these courses have that same attitude toward the importance that humanities plays, okay, in engineering itself. This gets, kind of back to what we were talking about before, what Aaron was basically, doing.
Thank you so much, Joe. There's also some incredible thoughts and, again, practical guidance as to what we do. I think you're quite right there. A few years back, I taught ethics in engineering design in an engineering school, and everything you've just mentioned, the things that Aaron mentioned, do surface there. And I think that's partly because we do treat ethics as an afterthought and we tend to teach it quite late in the process. But I can see there's definitely potential there to integrate it early on, to make it within the fabric of the actual curriculum itself, not just as a requirement for accreditation purposes or for any other kind of purposes. Thank you so much for your reflections. I would like to thank you all for attending, and unfortunately that's it in terms of time. Thank you, Professor Joseph Carvalko, Erin Chui, Dr. Erin Chui, thank you so much, Mr. Leon Wilson, all our attendees today. This video and the recording will be going up on the School for the Future of Innovation in Society's YouTube channel, so please keep an eye out on that. We thank you very much for your time and wish you a good day. Thank you so much.
You too. Thanks for inviting me again.
Thank you.